The candles in the great hall had been burning for 3 hours, and Alara Voss had counted every one of them, 47. She had started counting because she needed something to do with her eyes, and looking at Caden Ash was no longer something she could bring herself to do. She stood in the third row of unmated females, wearing the pale blue dress her mother had spent 2 weeks altering, and she told herself that the sound of her own heartbeat was not as loud as it felt. It was. She could feel it in her throat. The claiming ceremony happened once a year, at the first full moon after the winter solstice. Every pack across the Eastern Territories held one, though the details differed from pack to pack. In the Ashwood pack, it was formal. The Alpha stood at the front of the hall on a raised platform, flanked by his advisors and his family, and the unmated wolves were called forward one pair at a time, when the bond between them had been confirmed by the pack elders. No surprises, no drama. The bonds were identified weeks in advance, quietly, through the old methods, scent tracking, behavioral observation, the careful noting of which wolves sought each other out without meaning to. By the time the ceremony arrived, everyone already knew who would be claimed and by whom. Everyone had known about Alara and Caden for 6 weeks. She had not been told directly. That was not how it worked. She had been told by her mother, who had been told by the elder Mara, who had framed the whole thing as a quiet kindness. Alara had nodded. She had gone home and sat at the kitchen table for a long time, drinking tea that went cold, thinking about what it meant to be bonded to the Alpha's younger brother. Caden Ash was 26, broad-shouldered, well-liked, and comfortable in his own skin, in a way that Alara had always found slightly exhausting. He was not unkind. He had spoken to her maybe 4 times in her life, briefly, at pack gatherings, and he had always been polite in the way that attractive, well-positioned people were polite to people they did not really see. She had told herself that bonds were not about what came before. They were about what was built after. She had believed it enough to let her mother spend 2 weeks on the dress. The hall was full. 300 wolves, dressed in their best, seated on long wooden benches arranged in rows facing the platform. Candles lined every surface, the windowsills, the long tables pushed to the walls, the iron stands positioned between the benches. The smell of warm wax and pine resin, and 300 pack members in formal clothes filled the air. Alara breathed through her mouth. The first pair were called forward, a young male from the Eastern Border Patrol and a female from the Weaver's Quarter. They walked to the platform together, and the Alpha, Riker Ash, Caden's elder brother, a man who made every room feel slightly smaller just by being in it, placed his hands on their shoulders and spoke the words of recognition. The hall responded. The bond was sealed. The couple stepped back to applause that was warm and genuine, and the female was crying in the good way, and her new mate was looking at her like she was the only light source in the building. Alara watched and kept her hands folded in her lap, and did not let her face do anything embarrassing. 3 more pairs were called. She watched them all. A grandmother being claimed at 61 by a widower she had apparently been ignoring for a decade, which made everyone laugh. A pair of teenagers who were so nervous they could barely walk straight. A male from the hunting unit who had waited 7 years for his bond to manifest and now stood on the platform with his jaw working and no words coming out, while his mate quietly took his hand and did the talking for him. Then Elder Mara called her name. Alara stood. The back of her knees felt strange. She walked to the center aisle and turned toward the platform, and she could feel 300 pairs of eyes move to her, and then she could feel them move to Caden, who was stepping down from the family dais where the Alpha's relatives sat during the ceremony. He was wearing a dark jacket. His hair was neat. He looked, as he always looked, entirely unbothered. They met at the foot of the platform steps. She looked at him. He looked at her. And something passed across his face. Not disgust, not cruelty. Something smaller and in some ways worse. A flicker of something that might have been calculation, or resignation, or the expression of a person who had been hoping until this very moment that the elders had gotten it wrong. Elder Mara began to speak. The words of the ceremony were old, formal, and short. She spoke about bonds, about recognition, about the choice to accept what the blood already knew. She reached the part where Caden was meant to speak his affirmation. He did not speak. The silence stretched. It had a texture, that silence. Alara could feel it against her skin. Elder Mara waited. The hall waited. Alara looked at Caden and found that she had already, somewhere in the last 4 seconds, begun to understand what was about to happen. Her body understood it before her mind did, because her body went very still and very cold, the way things go still just before something falls. Caden Ash opened his mouth. "I reject the bond," he said. His voice was clear and steady and just loud enough to carry to the back row. He said it the way someone reads a memo. He said it the way someone files a form. He said it, and then he looked at the floor for one moment, and then he looked at Elder Mara, and then he stepped back. He did not look at Alara. She stood on the steps of the platform in her pale blue dress, and she heard the sound the hall made, that particular collective intake, 300 lungs pulling air at once, and then the sound that followed, which was murmuring, which was rustling, which was the noise of 300 people deciding at speed what kind of moment this was. Some of them decided it was sad. Some of them decided it was awkward. Some of them decided, and she could hear it in the texture of the sound, that it was funny. Not ha-ha funny. The other kind. The kind that spreads because it gives people somewhere to put their discomfort. Alara turned and walked back down the aisle. She counted the floor tiles. They were square, pale gray stone, each one roughly the same size. She counted them because the alternative was to hear the sound of the hall, which was becoming, moment by moment, something she did not want to have heard. She made it to 31 tiles before the door opened in front of her, brought by some instinct of basic courtesy on the part of the young male who had been stationed there as an usher, and she stepped through it and out into the cold night air. The door closed behind her. The cold hit her like a flat hand. It was January. The sky above the great hall was black and very clear, full of stars, the kind of sky that would have been beautiful at any other moment. Her breath came out in a cloud. She stood on the stone steps outside the great hall, with her arms hanging at her sides, and her pale blue dress making no impression whatsoever on the temperature, and she breathed. She was 23 years old. She was the pack healer's apprentice. She had 6 herb jars on her bedroom windowsill, each one labeled in her own handwriting. She had a scar on her left palm from a childhood accident involving a broken jar and a great deal of panic. She had, until approximately 4 minutes ago, believed that she was about to begin the part of her life that was different from all the parts that had come before. She pressed her left palm against her side, not hard, just resting there, and she stood in the cold and counted the stars for a while. It did not make her feel better, but it gave her eyes something to do. She heard the door open behind her. She did not turn around. Footsteps on stone, 2 people, light-footed, female. The tone of their voices already giving away that they were talking before they had even registered she was there. And then a laugh. Short, cut off fast, which was almost worse than if it had been allowed to run its full length. Then quiet, and hurried footsteps going the other direction. Alara did not turn around. She waited until the sound was gone completely. Then she walked down the steps along the side path that ran between the great hall and the storage buildings, and around to the back of the complex where the service lane was. She had used this path 100 times during pack events when she needed to get somewhere without walking through a crowd. It smelled like cold earth and pine sap. She knew every loose stone on it. She walked home through the back lanes of the pack settlement, avoiding the main paths, keeping to the side routes she had learned over 23 years of being someone who often needed to get somewhere without being noticed. Her mother would be inside, waiting. Her father would be seated by the fire with his face arranged in the expression he wore when he did not know what to say. She would have to walk past both of them. She stopped at the edge of the small garden behind their house and looked at the kitchen window, which was lit from inside, her mother's silhouette visible through the glass. She stood there for a while. The cold had moved into her fingers. She pressed her left palm against her other arm and felt the ridge of the scar, familiar and constant, and she breathed until her throat stopped doing the tight thing it had been doing since tile 31. Then she went inside. Her mother looked up from the table. The expression on her face was the one that meant she already knew, which meant someone had come out of the ceremony and made a message before Alara could even get home, which was the kind of efficiency that the pack was really very good at when it came to bad news. Alara, her mother said. I know, Alara said. I was there. She took off her shoes by the door and patted in her socked feet to the kitchen, and she filled the kettle and set it on the stove, and she stood with her back to the room while the water heated, and she did not cry. She had decided sometime between the back garden and the door that she was not going to cry tonight, not because crying was wrong, but because she was not ready to cry yet. She was still in the part before the crying, the numb, flat, very quiet part, and she intended to stay there for as long as she could. Her father said nothing. His silence was its own kind of company. The kettle boiled. She made 3 cups of tea. She brought them to the table and sat down and drank hers while it was still hot enough to be uncomfortable, because the discomfort of that was simple and manageable and hers to control. He gave no reason, her mother said finally. He does not need to give one, Alara said. This was true. A rejection at the ceremony was absolute and required no explanation. It was painful and rare, and happened maybe once a generation. But it was the right of any wolf to refuse a bond if they could not accept it. The pack laws were clear on this. Knowing it was within the law did not make it feel different. Her mother's hands tightened around her cup. Mara will need to be informed, Ilara said, about my status. I assume that happens automatically, but I should follow up. She heard herself saying these practical things and was grateful for them. Practical things were load-bearing. They held the shape of a conversation when the shape might otherwise collapse. Her mother stared at her. Is that all you want to say? For tonight, Ilara said, yes. She finished her tea. She rinsed the cup. She said goodnight to her parents, who looked at her with the particular helplessness of people who love someone and cannot do anything useful, and she went upstairs to her room. Her 6 herb jars sat on the windowsill, catching the moonlight: bloodroot, chamomile, feverfew, yarrow, elderberry, calendula. She had collected, dried, and labeled every one of them herself. She looked at them for a long time. Then she changed out of the pale blue dress, hung it up with care, and went to bed. She did not sleep for a very long time, but she lay still and breathed evenly, and let her mind go flat and quiet, which was the next best thing. Outside, the stars were still there. Inside, the house was warm. She pressed her left palm against the mattress and felt the familiar ridge of the scar and thought about nothing specific, about the smell of chamomile, about the repair she needed to make to the 3rd shelf bracket in the herb storage room, about the 3 patients she would check on tomorrow morning. She thought about the floor tiles. 42 to the exit. She had been wrong earlier. She had counted 31 before reaching the door, but the door was not the exit. The exit was the building itself, the whole thing, the ceremony and the candles and the 300 people, and the particular kind of hope she had carried into that room in her pale blue dress. 42. She filed that away and closed her eyes, and eventually, well past midnight, she slept. The next morning she was up before dawn. This was not unusual. She had always been an early riser, something her mother attributed to the healer's temperament and her father attributed to stubbornness. She dressed in her work clothes, plain dark trousers, a heavy wool top, her worn boots, and braided her hair back and went to the herb storage room attached to the back of the healer's cottage. The storage room was her best place. It smelled like dried things and cedar wood and the slight earthiness of roots, and it was always slightly dim, and it was hers alone in the mornings before Elder Healer Vance arrived. She moved through the routine of her work with the ease of long practice, checking moisture levels, rotating stock, noting what needed replenishing before the spring growing season. She had 3 shelves that were her own particular project, a small experimental collection of plants she was attempting to acclimatize to the local soil, and she spent a careful 20 minutes with them. She did not think about the ceremony. She thought about it at the market, later, when she went to collect the week's supply of raw beeswax, which they used as a base for several salves. The market was busy. It was a clear morning, cold but with good light, and the stalls were well attended. She walked through with her basket and her list, and she was aware, in a low, constant way, that people were looking at her. Not obviously, not rudely, most of them, but the slight repositioning, the eyes that glanced and glanced away, the conversations that resumed a half-beat after she passed. She was 23 and had lived here her whole life, and she knew the difference between being looked at normally and being looked at like a topic. She bought the beeswax. She bought a bunch of dried thyme from old Garen's stall, because he had a particularly good source and his prices were fair, and he had not looked at her differently once. She almost said something to him about it, but it would have been awkward to explain, and he was already wrapping the thyme in paper with the efficient movement of someone who had been doing the same thing for 40 years, so she just thanked him and moved on. She was passing the butcher's stall when she heard it. Not loud, not meant to be, but the wind was going the wrong way, and her hearing was good. 2 females from the hunting unit, standing just past the stall, angled away from her but not far enough. "Can you imagine," one of them was saying, "having to go home after that?" "I heard she didn't even cry," the other said. "Well," said the first, and then her voice dropped. "But not enough. What would be the point?" Ilara walked past. She did not slow down. She readjusted her basket on her arm and continued to the grain merchants at the end of the row, where she was expected to collect a particular variety of dried chamomile that she had ordered 3 weeks earlier. She paid for it, received it, noted that the drying quality was good, and walked home by the long route. What would be the point? She turned that over in her mind during the walk home, the way you probe a bruise to check how bad it is. She was trying to decide if it made her angry. It did, a little, but the anger was tired, and underneath it was something else, something quieter and older, the feeling of having been, for a long time, exactly as visible as people needed you to be, and no more. She put the chamomile away when she got home. She made notes in her supply ledger. She ate lunch alone because her mother was at a neighbor's house and her father was out on a survey of the pack's northern boundary fence, a job that regularly took him away for the whole day. In the afternoon, she visited her 3 patients. Old Willem, who had a chest complaint she was managing with steam treatments and a particular bark tea. Young Petra, 9 years old, currently recovering from a badly sprained ankle, and the female from the Eastern Patrol Unit whose name was Dora, and who had torn a shoulder muscle badly enough 2 months ago that she was only now returning to light duty. Ilara checked their progress, adjusted Willem's tea formula slightly, rewrapped Petra's ankle with fresh bandaging, and tested the range of motion in Dora's shoulder, and declared her cleared for non-combat patrol work starting the following week. Dora looked at her for a moment after the announcement, directly and without the sideways quality that most people had used today, and said, "Thank you, and for what it is worth, last night was wrong." Ilara paused. "It was within the law," she said. "That is not what I said," Dora said. Ilara nodded once and picked up her bag. She felt something in her chest shift slightly, just slightly, and she walked out to the lane and stood in the cool afternoon air and let the shift settle. The days that followed had a particular quality, not quite hostile, not quite normal, occupying some uncomfortable middle space. The pack, like all packs, was a tight social unit. What happened in it became part of the shared knowledge of 300 people within hours. What had happened to Ilara was, at this point, known by everyone, including the toddlers who couldn't quite understand it yet but had heard their parents say her name in a specific tone that meant it was important. She continued her work. She rose before dawn. She tended the herb room. She visited her patients. She attended the twice-weekly healers meeting with Vance and the other 2 apprentices. She went to the market when she needed to, and took the routes she needed to take. She was not hiding. She was just navigating. 2 weeks after the ceremony, Caden Ash and his new mate, a high-born female named Lyra from the Westridge pack, tall and self-possessed and thoroughly appropriate in every way, were formally introduced at a pack gathering. Ilara was at the gathering because attendance was expected. She stood near the back, beside the refreshment tables, with a cup of something warm in her hands, and she watched Caden stand with his arm around Lyra while Riker Ash made the introduction and the pack applauded. Caden looked well. That was the honest word for it. He looked well. Lyra was beautiful in the way that made sense. Not flashy, not demanding, just effortlessly right, the kind of beautiful that made people around her straighten up slightly without meaning to. Ilara watched for a few minutes. She noted that Caden did not look in her direction once. She noted that this was probably correct behavior on his part. She noted that it still felt like a stone in the pocket. Then she went and checked on old Willem, who had stayed home from the gathering because of the cold air, and she sat with him for an hour and listened to him talk about the summer he had spent fishing on the western coast 40 years ago, which was his favorite story, and she drank tea and let the story wash over her, and did not think about the gathering at all. On the walk home, alone, in the dark, she pressed her palm against her side and counted her steps. 114 from Willem's door to her own. She started learning them differently then, the distances, not as measurements of space, but as something to hold, a rope in her hands in the dark. She counted steps to places that mattered to her, from the herb room to the patient record cabinet, from her front door to Petra's, from the market entrance to old Garen's stall. She did not know why she was doing it. She only knew that it felt like something worth keeping. The snow came in the 3rd week, heavy, steady, the kind that settled properly and changed the sound of everything. The pack settlement went quiet in the particular way it went quiet under snow. All the sharp edges of sound softened. Ilara walked to work through it each morning and came home through it each evening and stood in her doorway some nights just to listen to the silence. She was not fine. She knew she was not fine because fine was not a thing she was interested in performing. But she was upright, and she was working, and the herb jars on the windowsill caught the winter light each morning, and told her, without speaking, that she had built things worth keeping even before anyone else had noticed her enough to take note. 42 tiles to the exit. She thought about that sometimes, and then, without quite deciding to, she stopped thinking about it. The number was there, it would always be there, but the door it had led to was behind her now, and the path ahead had no tiles, only steps. She started counting those instead. The letter arrived on a Thursday, 3 weeks into the worst of winter. It came through the official pack courier, which meant it had been sent with some formality, and it bore the seal of the Alpha King's territorial office, a thing that nobody in the Ashwood pack had seen in quite some time. Riker Ash signed for it in person. The courier, who had ridden 3 days to deliver it, was given a hot meal and a warm room, and every courtesy due to an envoy from the king's court. Ilara heard about the letter that same afternoon. from Elder Vance, who heard it from the head of the council, who had been in the room when it was opened. The letter announced that the Alpha King, Kael Draveth, would be sending a formal delegation to the Ashwood Pact within the month to discuss trade and territorial agreements that had been outstanding for 2 years. The delegation would arrive with 40 members. They would require accommodation, provisions, and the full hospitality of the pack. Vance told Alara about it because the delegation would include the king's own medical advisor and several support staff, and the pack's healer unit would be expected to coordinate with them. This meant extra work, preparation of the medical tent in the formal hosting grounds, and a full audit of pack medical resources that might need to be presented. "You'll be leading the audit," Vance said. He was a comfortable, efficient man who valued competence above almost everything else, which had always made Alara's relationship with him one of the easier ones. "You know those stores better than anyone." "I'll start tomorrow," Alara said. "Start today," Vance said, and went back to his records. Alara started today. She worked through the evening, after the other apprentices had gone home, going through the storage room shelf by shelf with her ledger and a fresh candle, logging quantities, checking expiry dates, noting what was low and what needed immediate ordering before the delegation arrived. It was detailed, absorbing work, the kind that filled up all the available space in her head and left no room for anything else, and she was grateful for it. She worked until the candle was half gone. Then she walked home through the snow, alone, counting her steps, and went to bed and slept better than she had in 3 weeks. In 2 days, spring would not yet have arrived, but something would arrive that was better: the word of the delegation's early departure from the Northern Territories, riding ahead of schedule, set to reach Ashwood Land within 12 days. Alara noted the date in her ledger. She looked at her audit list. She had 10 days to finish it. She would need 9. She pressed her palm flat on the desk, feeling the familiar line of the scar, and bent back over her work. 12 days later, on a morning that was still cold but carried the first real suggestion of something other than cold underneath it, a sound came through the pack settlement like a current through water, the sound of hooves and wheels, and a number of people arriving at once. Alara was in the storage room when she heard it. She did not go out to look. She had work to finish. She was 3 shelves from the end of her audit when the door opened and Vance put his head in. "They are here," he said. 42 in the party. The king is among them." Alara looked up from her ledger. "I thought it was a delegation." "It is," Vance said. "He leads it himself. Apparently he does that sometimes." He looked at her. "Finish your audit, then come to the hosting ground. They will want to inspect the medical tent." "Yes," Alara said. She looked back at her ledger. 3 more shelves. She finished them carefully, accurately, in the order she had planned. She capped her ink. She closed the ledger. She picked up her bag. She walked to the hosting ground through the lanes she knew by heart, counting her steps without meaning to, and the number she reached when she pushed open the side gate of the hosting compound was 108. The hosting ground was a wide open space on the eastern edge of the settlement, bordered by a low stone wall on 3 sides and the great forest on the 4th. In summer it was used for outdoor gatherings. In winter it was cleared and marked with wooden posts to define the space. The pack had erected 3 large canvas tents for the delegation, the largest of which was the meeting tent, the second a general shelter, and the third the medical tent, which was hers. She went to the medical tent first. She had set it up 2 days ago, had arranged the supplies precisely and checked the setup 3 times, and it was exactly as she had left it. Neat, organized, the kind of functional order that made her feel calm just looking at it. She walked through it once, checking each station. She was at the back of the tent, reviewing the supply table, when she heard the flap open. She assumed it was Vance. She did not look up immediately. "The cataloging system is unusual," said a voice that was not Vance's. She looked up. The man in the doorway was tall, not dramatically so, but enough that he filled the space. He was dressed in traveling clothes, dark and practical, the kind worn by someone who intended to be useful rather than observed. He had brown hair, a little longer than fashionable, and a face that was particular in a way that she noticed without being able to immediately describe. Not perfect, nothing soft about it, the kind of face that had been shaped by weather and decision-making, and had come out specific. He was looking at the supply table she had organized, and his expression was one of genuine attention. She waited. "Most medical setups arrange by category," he said. "Salves together, tinctures together. You have arranged by use." "By intended application," she said. "Wound care and sequence of treatment order. Pain management grouped by type. Infection management separate." She paused. "It is faster that way. When something is actually happening, you do not have time to remember categories." He looked at her then, directly. and his expression did not rearrange itself the way expressions usually did when they were performing something. He was just looking at her, actually looking, the way you look at something you want to understand. Kale Dravith, he said. She had known, in the last 30 seconds, that this was who he was. She had known it in the particular way you know things that you have been moving toward without realizing it, the way a door becomes visible at the end of a hall. Ilara Voss, she said. Pack Healer's apprentice. I manage the medical supply inventory. I know, he said. Vance mentioned you. He stepped further into the tent, looking at the table again. You cataloged all of this yourself? The audit took 9 days, she said. I have a healer shortage in the Northern Territories, he said. And the way he said it was not a complaint or a strategy. It was just a problem that frustrated him, stated plainly. 3 clinics without permanent staff. What you have set up here could run circles around what I have at 2 of those sites. Ilara looked at her supply table. She had spent 9 days on it. It had seemed like exactly the right amount of time. What is your current supply chain for the Northern clinics? She asked. He told her. It was, as she immediately identified, significantly inefficient in 2 specific ways. She said so. He did not look offended. He took a small notebook from his jacket pocket and wrote it down. She watched him write. 108 steps from the gate. She pressed her left hand against her side, not hard, just resting, and she let herself stand in the good organized quiet of the medical tent she had built, and she thought about what it meant that the first person to ask her a real question in 3 weeks was the most powerful wolf in the Eastern Territories. She did not yet know what it meant, but she noted it. Outside, the pack was moving and buzzing with the business of welcoming 42 official guests, with the formality and the food and the careful social work of hosting. Riker Ash would be shaking hands and making plans. Caden Ash would be standing in the right places and being charming. 300 pack members would be performing their collective hospitality. In the medical tent, Ilara Voss was explaining her supply chain logic to the Alpha King, who was listening with his notebook open and his full attention, and she was not counting tiles. She was here. That was something. The delegation stayed for 5 days. In the first 4, Ilara was busy in the medical tent, working alongside the king's medical advisor, a compact, precise woman named Harriet, who wore her hair in a severe plait and had strong opinions about tincture preparation that differed from Ilara's in 3 interesting and debatable ways. They debated them, professionally, thoroughly, with the particular pleasure of 2 people who loved the same subject. By the end of the 2nd day, Harriet had adopted one of Ilara's methods, and Ilara had accepted one of Harriet's, and they had agreed to exchange written notes after the delegation returned to the Northern Territories. It was the best 2 days Ilara had had in a long time. She did not see the Alpha King again until the 3rd afternoon. He found her in the tent again, this time with purpose. He had a list of questions about the Northern Clinic supply problem, building on their first conversation. She answered them. He asked better questions than most people she spoke to, not because he knew more, but because he listened carefully to the answers before forming the next one. One sensesa. He stayed for an hour. Harriet was there for part of it, which kept everything practical and professional, though Harriet left before he did, citing a secondary meeting with the PAX Council, and Ilara was alone with him for the last quarter hour. She was aware of this. She registered it the way she registered things she could not fully explain, with a certain carefulness, not alarm, just attention. He asked her how long she had been with the PAX Healer unit. 4 years as apprentice, she said. Before that, informal training. My mother has some skill with plants. She started teaching me when I was small. You should be running a clinic, he said. Not flattering, just observational, the way you note that a tool is suited to a particular job. She looked at him. Vance would be the one to ask about that. I am not asking Vance, Kale said. She pressed her palm against her side. I have been an apprentice for 4 years, she said carefully. There is a process. There is, he agreed. I am familiar with it. I have been trying to move 3 people through it for 2 years and it is not working. He closed his notebook. Are you happy here? The question was so direct and so unexpected that she did not have an immediate answer ready. She looked at her supply table, at the 9 days of work arranged in precisely the right order, at the jars and the labels and the quiet good logic of the place she had built. I am good at it here, she said. He looked at her for a moment, and she had the sense that he had heard the distinction between what she had said and what he had asked. He did not press it. I will be speaking with Riker tomorrow, he said, about a broader exchange of resources between territories. It may include medical staff. She nodded. Vance handles those discussions. Yes, Kale said. and he was already moving toward the tent flap. And he paused there and looked back once, and said, "Thank you for the supply chain analysis. It was useful." "You are welcome," she said. He left. She stood in the middle of the tent and breathed the cedar and herb smell of it, and she looked at her supply table, and she did not know what to do with the last quarter hour except file it carefully in the part of her mind where she kept things that needed time. On the fourth afternoon, she was in the lane beside the hosting ground, returning from a patient call, when she saw Caden. He was coming the other direction, part of a small group from the Pack Council, escorting some of the delegation members, and he saw her at the same moment she saw him. There was a half-second window where the world was very still. Then the group moved past. He nodded at her. Brief and correct, she nodded back. They did not speak. She walked the rest of the way to the herb room. She sat down on the low stool at the supply bench, and she pressed both hands flat on the worn wood surface and breathed. Not grief. Not quite. Something more like the feeling of pressing a healed scar, and finding it no longer hurt the same way. Still there. Always there. But different. The final evening of the delegation's stay, there was a formal dinner. Ilara was present as medical staff, seated at a long table near the wall with Harriet and 2 other members of Kale's support team. The dining hall was warm and loud, and full of the complicated social music of a large formal gathering. Ilara ate her food, talked with Harriet about spring growing season and its likely effect on local herb yields, and watched the room without appearing to. Kale was at the main table with Riker and the senior council members. He was not performing anything. He just sat and ate and talked and listened. He was the most powerful person in the room, and he moved through that fact with the ease of someone who had long since stopped needing to remind anyone of it. He looked up, once, across the full width of the hall. She looked back. He held it for 2 seconds. Then his attention returned to whatever Riker was saying. Ilara looked at her plate. She noticed, distantly, that she had not pressed her palm against her side once this evening. She noticed it the way you notice a habit you have been doing so long you forgot it was a choice. She filed that too. The delegation departed the next morning. They were efficient about it. 42 people who had arrived in formation left in formation, the same organization in reverse. Harriet gripped Ilara's hand at the gate and told her she was wasted as an apprentice, which was the nicest insult Ilara had received in a long time. She watched the party move down the lane until the tree cover took them. Then she went back to the herb room and her ledger and the work of the day. Behind her, somewhere in the Pack settlement, she knew that the conversations about the visit were already beginning. What had been agreed, what might change, what it meant for the Pack. She was not part of those conversations. She was an apprentice healer who managed the supply inventory and had spent 4 days in a tent talking about medicine with the king's advisor. She sat down at the supply bench. She opened the ledger. She had 3 shelves to update. She would finish them by noon. The first morning without the delegation was strange in a particular way that Ilara noticed and then did not mention to anyone, because it was difficult to explain. The Pack felt different, which was not accurate. The Pack was exactly the same, but something in the air of it had changed slightly, the way a room feels different after a window has been open even after the window is closed again. She went about her morning routine with the same precision she always did, but underneath the routine was a low hum of something she could not quite name. She was cataloging the new chamomile delivery when Vance appeared in the doorway with his hands behind his back and his expression carefully neutral, which meant he had news he was not sure how to frame. There was a communication, he said. In the packet the delegation left for Riker. Ilara waited. Specifically for the healer unit, Vance said. Regarding you. She set down the chamomile. What kind of communication? Vance brought his hands around from behind his back and held out a folded piece of paper. She took it. The paper was heavy, the kind used for official correspondence, and the writing inside was small and efficient and clearly done by someone who wrote a great deal. It was a formal inquiry, written to Vance, from the Alpha King's administrative office. It asked whether there was any possibility that the Pack Healer's apprentice Ilara Voss might be available to consult, on a temporary basis, with the Northern Clinic project. The inquiry was specific about what the consultation would involve: supply system design, inventory management, and training of local staff, and specific about what would be offered in exchange. It ended with a note, separate from the formal language, that said, "This inquiry is made with the full knowledge and support of Alpha Riker Ash, and the decision rests with Healer Vance, and with Miss Voss herself." She read it twice. "Well," Vance said. He was watching her. "It is your decision. You know I cannot spare you for more than 2 weeks, and only if the timing is right. But it is your decision." She folded the paper. She set it on the bench. "Can I think about it?" she said. You have 3 days, Vance said. They need an answer by then. He left her with the chamomile and the ledger and the folded paper. She looked at all 3. She reached out and touched the edge of the paper with one finger, not picking it up, just confirming it was real. She thought about Harriet, about the supply table she had built in 9 days, about the look on Cale's face when he had asked if she was happy here, and how carefully she had answered. She thought about the northern clinics with no permanent staff. She thought about 108 steps from the gate. She pressed her left palm flat on the bench, feeling the scar, and she looked at the chamomile delivery waiting to be logged, and she did what she always did when something needed to be decided. She finished her work first. The 3 days of thinking time were not comfortable. She spent them working, which helped, and she spent them lying awake at portions of the night in a way she had not done since the weeks after the ceremony, though the quality of the wakefulness was different. The wakefulness after the ceremony had been heavy and gray and turned inward. This wakefulness moved. It went in multiple directions, asked questions, circled possibilities. On the second morning, she sat at the kitchen table early, before her parents were up, with her hands around a cup of tea, and she thought about it without trying to manage the thinking. She had been in the Ashwood Pack for 23 years. She had been the healer's apprentice for 4. She was good at it, and she was not planning to leave it. But the inquiry was not asking her to leave. It was asking her to go somewhere for 2 weeks and do the specific things she was best at, and then come back. It was also asking her to go somewhere that the Alpha King would be. She turned that over. She was not naive. She had felt the weight of that conversation in the medical tent on the first day, and she had felt the 2-second look across the dining hall, and she had felt Harriet's comment about being wasted as an apprentice, which had not come entirely from nowhere. She did not know what these things added up to. She was not in the habit of building towers out of small observations, but she was also not in the habit of pretending the observations did not exist. She pressed her palm against the table. The scar was there. It was always there. The pack had humiliated her, not intentionally, not maliciously, not with planning, just with the particular thoughtlessness of a group of people who had decided she was not quite central enough to protect, and she had survived it. She was surviving it. She was getting up before dawn and doing her work and counting her steps and surviving it just fine. But surviving was not the same as building. She had spent the last several weeks being very careful with herself, very contained, keeping everything small and manageable and controlled. She understood why. She also understood that it could not be permanent. You could not live in the space between tiles forever. On the 3rd morning, she went to Vance's office. He looked up from his desk. "Yes," she said. He nodded once. 2 weeks only. 2 weeks only, she agreed. She left his office and walked back to the herb room and stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at her shelves, the ordered rows of her own careful work. She had 7 days before she was due to leave for the Northern Territories. She spent those 7 days completing every outstanding task, creating detailed handover notes for the other apprentices, and adding a 4th jar to her windowsill collection, goldenrod, which she had been meaning to dry and store for months. She labeled it in her own handwriting. She set it in the line with the others. Then she packed a bag and counted the steps from her front door to the Northern Road junction, and started walking. The Northern Territories were different from the Ashwood lands in ways that became apparent gradually, rather than all at once. The air was sharper, the trees were different, denser, darker, the kind of forest that had been there long enough to have opinions. The roads were older and wider than the ones Alara knew, worn down by centuries of use. She traveled in a small group, a guide provided by the king's office and 2 other people making the same northward journey for different reasons, a council messenger and a merchant, and they traveled comfortably and without incident, stopping at the staging house at the midpoint of the route, arriving at the northern seat on the evening of the 2nd day. The seat of the Alpha King's territory was not what she had expected, which told her something about what she had expected. She had expected something imposing, deliberately grand, the kind of architecture designed to remind visitors of hierarchy. What she found was large, certainly, a complex of buildings set into the side of a forested hill, surrounded by cleared ground that served as market, training space, and common area all at once. But it was working large, practical large, the kind of large that came from needing to house and feed and organize a significant number of people over a long period of time. She liked it. Harriet met her at the gate, which was kind and unexpected, and told her she had been expected and noted. Harriet showed her to a small, clean room on the 2nd floor of the healer's building, which was its own dedicated space, impressive by pack standards, underfunded by the standards of what it was trying to do. 3 clinics in the surrounding region fell under its administration. All 3 were understaffed. Let me show you what we are working with, Harriet said, and then you can tell me where to start. Elara set down her bag. She pulled out her ledger. She looked at Harriet. Start from the beginning, she said. Harriet started from the beginning. By the end of the first evening, Elara had 14 pages of notes, 2 immediate action items, and a clear picture of a system that was not badly designed so much as never fully designed at all. It had grown piece by piece without overall architecture, and the gaps between pieces were where the problems lived. She could see the shape of what needed to happen. She could see it the way she could see the shape of a remedy when someone described their symptoms, the parts fitting together into something actionable. She slept well that night. The room was quiet, and the air was sharp and different, and outside the window the northern forest was its own kind of presence, and she lay in the unfamiliar bed and breathed and felt, for the first time in a while, the particular aliveness of being in a place she had not been before. The next morning she met the king. Not formally. He was coming out of the main building as she was crossing the common ground on her way to the healer's building, and they nearly collided at the path junction, and he stopped and she stopped, and there was a moment of uncomplicated surprise on both their faces. You arrived, he said. Yesterday evening, she said. Harriet showed me the situation. I have some initial thoughts. He looked at her, the way he had looked at her in the medical tent, actually, directly, without performing it. I would like to hear them, he said. After your morning. I have meetings until midday. After midday is fine, she said. They went their separate ways. She walked to the healer's building and spent the morning with Harriet going through the clinic records in detail, and by noon, she had a clear initial plan for reorganizing the supply chain between the 3 clinics and the central healer's building, which would, if implemented correctly, reduce redundancy and cut the ordering costs by somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2. She had it written out clearly on 3 pages of her ledger by the time she went to meet Cale. He was in a working room on the ground floor of the main building. Not an impressive room, not a throne room, just a room with a long table covered in papers and 2 people who were clearly in the middle of leaving as she arrived. They left. He was pulling his jacket straight and reaching for the cup of cold tea on the corner of the table when she came in, and he waved toward the chair across from him with the same gesture he would use to wave toward a chair across from himself in any working conversation. She sat down. She put her 3 pages on the table. He read them. He read them properly, all the way through, making no sound. This is practical, he said when he had finished. It should be, Elara said. The components exist. They just need to be connected properly. He looked at the pages again, then at her. How long will implementation take? With full cooperation from the clinic staff, 6 weeks. With partial cooperation, possibly 3 months. Cooperation is your variable, not mine. He almost smiled, not quite, but almost. The clinic staff have opinions, he said. Everyone with opinions about their supply chain is manageable, she said. Explain the benefit to the patient outcome, not the operational efficiency. They will cooperate. He picked up the pages and set them with his other papers, not dismissively, with the care of something he intended to return to. I will have them sent copies today. She nodded and started to gather her things. Elara, he said. She looked up. He was watching her with the expression she was beginning to recognize. Not performing, not managing, just looking. I am glad you came, he said. She looked at him for a moment. She thought about 42 tiles and 108 steps and 9 days, and the supply table built in exactly the right order. So am I, she said, and then she picked up her bag and left, and she walked back to the healer's building in the sharp, clear northern air, and she did not count her steps once. She was 4 days into the consultation when she understood what was happening, and she was 5 days into it when she decided not to understand it, because understanding it would require deciding something, and she was not ready to decide something yet. What was happening was this. Cale Dravith came to the healer's building in the mornings, ostensibly to check on the consultation's progress, and he stayed longer each time. The progress conversations were genuine. He had real questions and she had real answers. But the conversations did not end at the progress. They moved, the way conversations move when 2 people are thinking at a similar speed and find themselves still talking when the official topic has been covered. He told her about the Northern Territories. Not the political geography, which she could have found in any pack record, but the actual geography. The river that changed course every spring. The 3 valleys that were perpetually 20 minutes colder than everywhere else. The particular community in the eastern settlement that had been using the same medicinal plant preparation for 2 generations, because a healer who had passed through in the previous century had left them the knowledge, and they had never stopped. She told him about her herb room at Ashwood, about the experimental shelf, about old Garen's thyme, which was reliably the best in the market, about the patient Willem and the fishing story and the way he told it, exactly the same every time, which was the thing about it she loved. She had not talked like this in a long time, not since the ceremony had made her careful. She had not known, until she was doing it again, how much of herself she had been storing away out of habit. On the 6th day, one of the clinic managers came to the healer's building with a problem. His name was Owen, he was 40, and he had a voice that suggested he had spent considerable time being the person who pointed out what was wrong. He had a list of objections to the supply reorganization. Elara listened to all of them. Then she explained, point by point, why each objection was either addressed in the plan already or based on a misunderstanding of how the plan worked. She was patient and specific, and did not soften the parts that needed to stay firm. Owen left having adopted 3 of his 4 objections into acceptance and holding the 4th in reserve, which she considered a productive outcome. When she came out of the clinic manager's meeting, Cale was in the hallway. He had clearly been nearby for at least part of it. Owen is not easy, he said. Owen is fine, Elara said. He wanted to be heard. He was heard. That is usually enough. Cale looked at her. Is that what you do? She thought about it honestly. With patience, yes, she said. You cannot treat someone who does not feel heard. Same principle. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I have a meeting at the Eastern Settlement the day after tomorrow. We will pass through the valley I mentioned, the perpetually cold one. If you wanted to see it, there is room in the traveling party. She looked at him. Is there a medical purpose? There is a small clinic at the Eastern Settlement, he said. One of the 3. She thought about it for exactly as long as it deserved. Yes, she said. That makes sense. The trip to the Eastern Settlement took most of a day, and the valley was precisely as cold as he had described, and the clinic there was in the best shape of the 3, run by a senior healer named Colin who was efficient and slightly suspicious of outside consultation, until he saw Elara's 3-page plan, at which point his suspicion became professional respect, and the meeting lasted 2 hours. On the way back, the traveling party passed through a section of forest that was different from the rest, older, the trees wider and set further apart, the light through them different in quality. The party slowed naturally in it. Even the horses slowed. Elara and Cale were riding at the back of the small group. They had been talking about Colin's clinic for some time and had reached a natural pause. He said, Can I ask you something that is not about the clinics? She looked at him. Yes. Are you planning to stay in the Ashwood pack? She thought about it. I have not planned to leave, she said. That is not the same thing, he said, which was exactly the distinction she had drawn with him about happiness, and she recognized it and felt the reflection of it. No, she agreed, it is not. He did not push it further. The forest moved around them, and the cold air moved through it, and the older trees stood the way old things stand, without needing to explain themselves. She pressed her palm against her side, lightly. She noted that Cale had not once, in 7 days, looked at her with any of the sideways quality she had grown used to from people who had witnessed the ceremony. He did not look at her like a topic. He did not look at her like something that had happened. He looked at her like she was here, in this moment, in this forest, and that was the entirety of what she was. It was, she thought, a very good way to be looked at. She did not say any of this. She looked at the old trees and breathed the sharp air and kept riding. She had 7 days left of the consultation. She intended to use them well. The Harvest Assembly was the largest gathering in the Eastern Territories, held in the 3rd week of autumn, when the crops were in and the weather was still mild enough for large outdoor events. Every alpha and pack leader in the regional territory was expected to attend. It happened at the neutral ground, an ancient open field at the center of the territory, equidistant from each of the major packs, where a temporary settlement was erected each year for the 3 days of the assembly. Elara had never attended it before. The Ashwood pack sent representatives, usually Riker Ash and his senior council members, and occasionally specific specialists if there was relevant business. This year, for the first time, Vance had been asked whether the healer unit could send someone, as the medical consultation in the Northern Territories had generated enough interest to warrant a wider discussion. Vance had sent Elara. She traveled with the Ashwood delegation, Riker's party, 6 people, a comfortable enough journey of 3 days by road. She rode near the back of the group, which suited her. Riker was courteous to her in the impersonal way he was courteous to everyone outside his immediate family circle. Caden was not in the delegation. She noted this without significance. The neutral ground was already alive when they arrived on the afternoon of the first day. Dozens of tents, fires, the smell of cooking and horses, and the particular noise of large numbers of people who saw each other once a year and were therefore performing a concentrated version of themselves. She found the healers section. There was always a dedicated healers area at the assembly, and introduced herself to the 3 other pack healers who were there, one of whom she had corresponded with by letter and was very pleased to meet in person. She spent the first evening in the healers section, sharing notes and discussing cases and comparing methods, and it was exactly the right way to spend an evening. She did not see Cale until the second morning. He was crossing the main common area with 2 of his advisors, moving at the pace of someone who had a full schedule and no spare moments in it. He saw her at the same time she saw him, and he said something to his advisors without breaking stride, and the advisors peeled off to one side, and he came to where she was standing by the edge of the path. "You are here," he said. "Vance sent me for the medical coordination session this afternoon," she said. He nodded. Then, "Are you free this evening? There is a working dinner I need to be at, but it ends by the 8th hour. I would like to speak with you." She looked at him. "About the clinics?" He met her eyes. "Not only." She held his gaze for a moment. A number of things moved through her, none of them settled. "After the 8th hour is fine," she said. He went back to his advisors. She went back to the healers section and sat down and looked at the notes she had been reviewing before he had crossed the common area, and the notes were the same as they had been, and the situation was very different. She had known, in the way you know things before you are ready to name them, that the consultation was not only a consultation. She had known it the way you know a river is deep before you step into it, from the quality of the stillness above the surface. She had stayed in the shallows deliberately, keeping everything professional, working the work and only the work, and it had been the right thing to do, and she had been glad of it. But he had just said not only. In front of 2 advisors, in the middle of a public gathering, with the directness that she had come to understand was just how he spoke when he meant something. She breathed. She put the notes down. She walked to the edge of the healers section where there was a low wooden fence and a view of the field beyond it, and she stood there and let herself think clearly about what she knew. She knew that she had been rejected publicly in front of her entire pack 6 weeks before the consultation began. She knew that the rejection had not broken her, though it had reshaped her. She knew that she was 23 years old and had recently spent 2 weeks doing her best work and being seen doing it, and that this had changed something in her that she was not prepared to give back. She also knew that Cale Draveth had come to the medical tent on the first day of the delegation, not because he needed to, but because he had chosen to, and that he had ridden with her through the cold valley, not because it was required, and that he had asked whether she was planning to stay in the Ashwood pack with the particular care of someone who wanted the answer to mean something. She pressed her palm flat against the fence railing. After the 8th hour, she went to the medical coordination session and did her work, which was good and useful and went well. She ate a quick supper with the healer from the pack she had corresponded with, whose name was Ellen and who was funny and pragmatic and exactly the kind of person Elara could have spent hours talking to if the evening were different. She made her apologies politely at the 7th hour and went to the agreed place, the far end of the assembly ground, past the last row of tents, where a low stone wall marked the edge of the field, and beyond it the old grass ran down toward a tree line. He was already there. He was standing with his hands in his pockets and his face turned toward the tree line, and he turned when he heard her coming, and he was as particular and specific as he always was, the kind of face that had been shaped by things that were real. She stood a little way from him and they both looked at the tree line for a moment. "I am not good at this," he said. She looked at him, surprised. He did not look like someone who expected to be bad at things. "I do not mean conversation," he said. "I mean whatever this is, the part between knowing and saying." She breathed. "I am not especially good at it either," she said. "I know." He turned to face her properly. "You have been very careful. I noticed." She thought about saying something deflecting, and did not. "I had reason to be careful," she said, "before the consultation." He was quiet for a moment. She had never told him about the ceremony, not directly, but she understood from his expression that he knew. It was the kind of thing that was known, in packs, in territories. She had not known how she would feel about him knowing. She found she minded less than she had expected. "What I am about to say," he said, "I want to say clearly, because I think you deserve to hear things clearly." She stood very still. "I know what was done," he said. "I know how it was done. And I know that the pack that should have stood behind you did not. I am not asking you to receive what I am saying as a correction to that. I am asking you to receive it as a separate thing, on its own ground, with no connection to what came before." She looked at him. Her heart was doing something complex. "I found you in a medical tent," he said, "arranging your supplies in exactly the right order. And every day since then I have thought about it, not because of the supplies, because of the person who built that order, because she understood that when something is actually happening, you do not have time to remember categories." He stopped. "That is who you are. That is who I have been watching for 2 weeks." She pressed her palm against her side. "Kale," she said, and her own name for him was strange and steady in her mouth. "I am not asking you to decide anything tonight," he said. "I am asking you to know." She looked at him for a long time. The field was dark and the tree line was darker, and the stars above were the same stars she had stood under outside the great hall in her pale blue dress on the worst night of the last several months. She was a different person than she had been that night. Not different in the ways that changed what was true, different in the ways that changed what she could hold. "I know," she said. He looked at her. "That is enough for tonight." She nodded. They stood at the stone wall for a while longer, not saying much, watching the tree line, and the cold moved through the field and she was not cold, and the assembly hummed behind them, and she breathed. When she walked back to the healers section later, she did not count her steps. She had decided something, not everything, not the big complicated things that would need time and clarity and several more honest conversations, but one thing. She was not going to be careful anymore in the way she had been careful. That way of careful had served her when she needed it. She did not need it the same way now. She opened the door of the healer's tent and sat down on her cot and looked at her bag and her ledger and the 4 jars she had brought because she never went anywhere without a few of them, and she thought about the person who had arranged supplies in exactly the right order because she understood that when something was actually happening, you did not have time to remember categories. That was who she was. She had known it all along. The morning of the 3rd day of the harvest assembly broke cold and clear, the kind of morning that felt deliberate, like the sky had thought about it. Ilara was up before most of the camp, as usual, and she walked the perimeter of the assembly ground in the early gray light, while the fires were being restoked and the kitchen tents were beginning to smell of something warm. She had slept. That surprised her. She had expected the night to be wakeful in the way the nights after the ceremony had been wakeful, but it was not. She had lain in the narrow healer's cot and breathed the tent air, and been aware of what she had said and what it meant, and she had fallen asleep anyway, which was possibly the most honest thing she could have done. The assembly's final day had its formal events in the afternoon. The closing ceremony, the signing of whatever agreements had been reached over 3 days of working meetings, the traditional shared meal that closed every harvest assembly. The morning was technically free time, given over to the informal conversations that the formal structure never quite made room for. Ilara returned to the healer section and had breakfast with Ellen and 2 other healers, and the conversation was about medicinal methods, and the conversation was good, and she was fully present in it, which she took as a sign that whatever was happening to her was not destabilizing her so much as opening something up. She spent the late morning reviewing her consultation notes. She had a full report to write for Vance when she returned. She had recommendations for all 3 clinics. She had Harriet's contact information and a standing agreement to exchange seasonal updates. She had 14 pages of notes that were going to form the basis of a structural change in how the Northern Territory medical system operated. She had done good work. The work was real, and it would matter, and it was hers. She was thinking about this, about the work, about what it meant to her, when she became aware of movement in the main common area, a change in the quality of the assembly's noise. She looked up from her notes. The formal afternoon events were not supposed to begin for another 2 hours. She stood. Through the gaps between the tents, she could see that people were moving toward the common area, not urgently but with the particular directional pull of people who know something significant is about to happen and want to see it. She saw several pack leaders moving that way. She saw the Ashwood delegation gathering, Riker Ash moving to the front. She put her ledger down and walked to the edge of the healers section to see. Kale was in the common area. He had not arranged it formally, no platform, no announced schedule. Just himself in the center of the space that had naturally cleared around him the way space cleared around him, with 2 of his senior advisors standing a respectful distance behind. The alpha leaders were gathering in a loose arc, the way they gathered when something official was about to be said. Ilara stood at the edge of the crowd. He was looking at something. She followed his gaze. He was looking at her. She went still. He said something to his advisors, briefly, and they both managed to look professionally neutral in a way that was clearly covering something. Then he walked across the common area, through the crowd that shifted to make space without being asked, and came to where she was standing at the edge. The crowd did not disperse. They rearranged. They were watching. She was aware of Riker Ash standing 30 feet away. She was aware of the Ashwood delegation and the other pack leaders, and 300 people at the harvest assembly, and the clear, cold morning air, and the particular stillness that comes before something that cannot be taken back. She was also aware that she was not afraid. She had been afraid at the ceremony, afraid in the way you are afraid of the thing you want most when you know it might not come. She had not been afraid since then. She had been careful, which was different, and she had stopped being careful last night. She stood in the morning light and looked at him. "I know I said I was not asking you to decide anything last night," he said. His voice was not loud. It was exactly loud enough. "You did say that," she said. "I need to amend it," he said, "because I have been not deciding things for 2 weeks and I find that I am done with it." She looked at him. The crowd around them was completely silent. That particular silence, 300 people choosing not to make noise, had a weight she recognized from the last time she had stood in this kind of silence, and the weight was entirely different now. "What are you deciding?" she said. He looked at her with the directness that was just how he was, that she had learned to recognize as honesty rather than pressure, that made everything he said land in the specific place it was aimed. "To ask," he said, "in front of everyone here, because you have had things done to you privately enough, and you deserve to have the good things done in public." Her breath caught once, just once. "Ilara Voss," he said, "will you allow me to claim the bond that I have known was here since I first walked into a tent and found you had arranged your supplies in the right order?" She pressed her left palm flat against her thigh, felt the scar. She thought about the tiles, 42 to the exit, the floor of the great hall, cold and gray, and the counting she had done to keep herself upright. She thought about 108 steps to the gate of the hosting ground. She thought about the cold valley, and the old trees, and the honest question about whether she was planning to stay, and the things she had said last night in the dark at the stone wall. "I know." She looked at him. She looked at all of it, the assembly crowd, the pack leaders, Riker Ash in her peripheral vision with an expression she would not look at yet, the advisors, the morning, the weight of public moment and private decision sitting on the same point. She thought about the person who arranged supplies in the right order, because when something was actually happening, you did not have time to remember categories. "Yes," she said. The bond came like a door closing against weather, not a crash, not a sudden thing, but a settling, a rightness that had always been there stepping forward into the light. Her wolf, which had been quiet for months, surfaced the way a tide comes in, not dramatic, not violent, just inevitable, taking back the space it was always meant to occupy. She had forgotten how much room it needed. He put his hand out and she took it, and the connection between them completed, and around them 300 people who had gathered for a harvest assembly found themselves witnessing something rarer and more consequential. She did not look at the crowd. She looked at him. He was looking at her the way he always looked at her, actually, directly, without performing it, and she was looking back the same way. Behind her, somewhere in the crowd, she heard the sound of people beginning to respond, the warm, complicated sound of witnessing something real. She heard Riker Ash say something to someone beside him. She heard the Ashwood delegation shift. She held Kale's hand in the clear, cold morning air and breathed. Her left palm was against her side. The scar was there. It would always be there. But it was a healed thing, a closed thing, and the hand pressed against her thigh was her own hand, open, no longer needing to press. She had things to do. She had a full report to write for Vance. She had a clinic supply system to oversee from a distance until it was properly established. She had 4 herb jars in her bag, and 2 more waiting on a windowsill in a room she would return to, and then eventually leave, and the leaving would be a beginning rather than a loss. There were conversations ahead that would be complicated. There were things to decide, to organize, to build. There were people who would have opinions about what had just happened. There were 300 witnesses who would carry the news back to their packs and their territories. There would be time for all of it. Right now there was this, the morning, the open field, the bond settled into place like something returning home. She let herself have it. She let herself be here, in this specific moment, with no tiles to count and no steps to manage and no quiet containing. Just this. Just here. She squeezed his hand once, briefly, the way you touch something real to confirm it. He did not look away. Neither did she. The settlement that Kale called home had a name that did not quite translate from the old language, something approximating steady ground, though Ilara had heard at least 4 different versions of the translation from 4 different people, which she found more accurate than any single version would have been. It was neither grand nor modest. It was the kind of place built for permanence rather than impression. She arrived with 2 bags and 7 herb jars, the windowsill collection from Ashwood having gained 1 more before she left. Goldenrod, chamomile, feverfew, yarrow, elderberry, calendula, and now lavender, which she had started from seed herself 2 springs ago. 7 jars in a line, labeled in her own handwriting. Harriet met her at the gate again. Harriet met her at the gate every time. Elara was beginning to understand. Because Harriet was the kind of person who simply showed up when it mattered and did not require explanation for it. She gripped Elara's arm at the elbow, briefly and firmly, and said nothing, which was the right thing to say. Elara was given a room in the main building, larger than the one in the healer's building she had used during the consultation. It had a wide windowsill that ran the full length of the window, which she noted immediately and did not mention yet. There were conversations ahead. She had known this. She had known it from the moment she said yes in the morning light of the assembly field, and she had not been afraid of the conversations, only aware of them. They came over the following days in the order she had loosely predicted: formal, informal, political, personal, the layers of consequence that came with the Alpha King claiming a mate at a public gathering. Riker Ash sent a message. It was careful and official, and wished her well with the particular tone of someone who was managing several complicated things at once. She replied carefully and officially. The tone between them was correct, which was the appropriate starting point. The senior advisors were professional. One of them, a woman named Grace who had served the northern seat for 15 years, and had eyes like someone who had seen everything, and developed specific opinions about most of it, came to speak with Elara alone on the 3rd day. She sat across from Elara at the table in the working room and explained, in clear and bloodless terms, what the political weight of the situation was, who would be watching, and what would be required of Elara in the public-facing aspects of her new position. Elara listened to all of it. She nodded through the briefing. When Grace finished, she looked at Elara with those particular eyes and said, "Do you have questions?" "2," Elara said. "The first is about the clinic project. I want to confirm that my involvement continues in an active capacity, not ceremonial." Grace's expression shifted marginally. "That can be arranged." "The second," Elara said, "is whether the position requires me to pretend I do not know what I know about people's motivations, or only to behave correctly regardless of them." Grace looked at her for a moment. "The second," Grace said. "Always the second." Elara nodded. "That I can do." Grace left. Elara sat for a moment in the working room, and then she went to find the right shelf space for her 7 herb jars. She placed them on the wide windowsill of her room, 7 in a row, catching the northern light, which was different from the Ashwood light but sufficient. She looked at them for a moment. She was not done becoming. She understood that. There were things ahead of her that she had no complete map for, decisions and difficulties and the long, complicated work of building something new. She was not naive about any of it. But she knew what she was. She had known it in the medical tent with her supplies arranged in the right order. She had known it in the herb room at Ashwood at dawn with the cedar smell and the careful rows. She had known it on the floor of the great hall counting tiles, and again at the stone wall in the dark field, and again in the morning light when she had said yes, and felt her own wolf step fully back into the light it was meant to inhabit. She pressed her left palm flat on the windowsill beside the jars. The scar was there. It would always be there. She looked at the 7 jars in the northern light and thought about what she had built, piece by piece, starting from almost nothing. Starting from 42 tiles to the exit, and a pale blue dress and the particular cold of the night air on a January evening. She had not planned for this. She had planned for much smaller things. But she had built herself, day by day, in the quiet of the herb room, and the patience of the patient rounds and the 9-day audit, and the 14 pages of notes, and the working conversations, and the honest answers. She had built something durable out of difficult material, and it had been enough, more than enough. She was the Alpha King's claimed mate. She was the consultant who had redesigned the Northern Clinic supply chain. She was the healer's apprentice who had arranged her supplies in the right order, because when something was actually happening, you did not have time to remember categories. She was Elara Voss. The windowsill was long. There was room for more jars. She was already planning which ones. She had a letter to write to Vance, a thorough and detailed one. A proper completion of the consultation with full recommendations, and a final report on the clinic project status. She owed him that, and she intended to give it. She sat at the desk in her new room, and she opened her ledger to a clean page and she wrote, cleanly, and specifically, and in the handwriting she had trained to be legible under difficult conditions, everything he needed to know. It took 2 hours. When she was done, she sealed it and addressed it, and set it by the door to be sent with the morning courier. She went to the window. The northern forest ran to the edge of the horizon, dark and dense and permanent. The evening was coming in, the sky going that particular deep blue that happened at the hinge point between afternoon and dark. There was a fire somewhere below the window, and the smell of it came up through the glass. She thought about the fishing story, about old Willem, who told it exactly the same way every time. She hoped he was well, and she thought she would check, and she thought she would write to the apprentice who was covering his case, and she thought about the particular smell of the herb room in the early morning, which she missed with a sharpness that was not grief, but was adjacent to it. She would go back, eventually. She would go back for Vance's formal acknowledgement and for the conversations that needed to happen in person, and she would walk through the lanes of the Ashwood settlement and count her steps, because she always counted her steps. And the number would be different now, because everything was different now. The pack would look at her. She knew this. She knew exactly how they would look at her, and she knew what they would be thinking. And she knew that some of them were the same people who had stood in the great hall and heard the silence of Caden Ash not speaking, and had made a sound in their throats that meant it was the other kind of funny. She let herself know this fully, completely, without managing it. And then she let it move through her and out. Caden Ash was living his life somewhere in the Eastern Territories. He was with Lyra, who was appropriate and beautiful and probably right for him in the ways that mattered. They had built something. She did not wish them badly. She also did not particularly wish them well, and that was the honest truth of it, and she did not intend to perform anything other than the honest truth. She was not a person shaped by what had been done to her. She was a person who had done her own shaping, in the years before and in the months after, in the herb room and the patient rounds and the audits and the consultations and the cold valley and the stone wall. What had been done to her was a fact. It was not a definition. She looked at her 7 jars in the northern light. She thought about what Ellen had said, the healer she had met at the assembly, who had gripped her hand when she left and said, "Come visit the Southern Pack Clinic sometime. I have a drawing method I want to show you." And Alara had said she would, and she had meant it, and she would write that letter too, and the visit would happen, and the drawing method would be interesting or it would not, and either way she would learn something. There were so many things to learn, so many places her knowledge could go. She had spent 4 years apprenticed in a herb room and 2 weeks redesigning a supply system, and she had barely started. The Northern Territories were large. The clinic project was only the first piece. There were plant species she had not yet studied, preparation methods she had only read about, patients she had not yet sat beside. She had work to do. Good work, specific work, the kind that only got better when you kept doing it. She went back to the desk and opened her ledger to a new page. She wrote at the top, in her careful handwriting, "Spring planting priorities, northern climate." She wrote until the room was properly dark. Then she lit the lamp and kept writing. Outside, the northern forest settled into the night, and the fire smell rose from below, and the 7 jars on the windowsill stood in a line like a small bright argument for everything she had built and everything she intended to keep building. She did not count tiles. She did not press her palm. She wrote.